Jodi Arias made headlines when she was charged with murdering her ex-boyfriend Travis Alexander in June 2008. After the gruesome, salacious details surrounding the murder were revealed, Arias testified during the 2013 trial that she had killed Alexander in self-defense. She was found guilty of first-degree murder, and later sentenced to life in prison after two juries deadlocked on whether to impose the death penalty. Convicted killer Jodi Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California. In the summer of 2008, Arias made national headlines when she was charged with murdering her ex-boyfriend Travis Alexander, a 30-year-old member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who was working as a motivational speaker and insurance salesman. Arias and Alexander had met at a conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, in 2006, while he was living in Arizona and she was a resident of Palm Desert, California. By the following year, they were a committed couple. After only 5 months as a couple, however, the two went their separate ways in late June 2007 but still maintained a sexual relationship. On June 9, 2008, Alexander's body was found in a pool of blood in the shower of his Mesa, Arizona, home by friends who had become increasingly worried about his whereabouts. Almost immediately after entering the residence, the young men began taking in the heinous crime scene. In the bathroom, they found Alexander with a gunshot wound to the head, more than 24 stab wounds, and a deeply and widely slit throat. Investigators later determined that the murder had occurred 5 days before his body was found, on June 4, 2008. Arias quickly became the focus of investigations. She was indicted on first-degree murder charges on July 9, 2008, and arrested in California soon after. Arias initially denied any involvement in the killing, despite the discovery of her DNA mixed with Alexander's blood at the crime scene, but she later changed her story, claiming that she and her ex had been attacked by two masked intruders. After killing Alexander, the criminals decided to let her live, she told the police, adding that she chose not to alert authorities at the time because she feared the intruders might seek revenge. Testimony in Arias's trial began in early January 2013, which was aired live to the public and became a media sensation. The following month, the alleged killer took the witness stand in her defense, from where she would testify for 18 consecutive days. Already infamously known for her different accounts of Alexander's murder, Arias stated that she had killed her ex in an impassioned act of self-defense. She testified that Alexander had frequently abused her and that she killed him after he came at her in a fit of rage when she dropped his camera. She also claimed to have suffered memory loss as the result of emotional trauma experienced during the incident, with a psychological expert corroborating that she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. "Lying isn't typically something I just do," Arias stated during the trial in response to a query from the jury. "The lies I've told in this case can be tied directly back to either protecting Travis's reputation or my involvement in his death, because I was very ashamed." On May 8, 2013, Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. 5 jurors found her guilty of premeditated murder and 7 found her guilty of both premeditated and felony murder, a verdict that sparked elation among Alexander's family members. However, the judge declared a mistrial in the penalty phase after the jury deadlocked on whether Arias deserved the death penalty. The penalty retrial began in October 2014, with a new jury revisiting the same evidence presented the first time around. This time, the focus was on the psychological makeup of both parties, with the defense attempting to portray their client as a vulnerable woman and Alexander as emotionally and physically abusive. In March 2015, the second jury was unable to agree on Arias's sentence as well, removing the option of the death penalty and leaving punishment terms to Judge Sherry Stevens. On April 13, after expressing remorse for her actions in a statement, Arias received a life sentence without the possibility of parole after 25 years, and she began serving her term at the Arizona State Prison Complex Perryville. Although Arias appealed her conviction and sentencing, the process was bogged down by transcript errors and omissions. The court record was finally declared complete in April 2017, nearly 2 years after the appeals process began, and that summer a 2018 deadline was established for the defense and prosecution to file their legal briefs. Additional complications surfaced in October 2017, when Arias alleged in a civil suit that the head of her legal team broke attorney-client privilege by disclosing confidential information for the express purpose of financial gain and his own public redemption in a tell-all book about the case. Alvin Neely was madly in love with Judith and Adams, later to become Judith and Neely, the troubled daughter of a large family from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. No stranger to trouble himself, Alvin had been committing petty crimes and stealing cars throughout his young adult life. Not much else is known about Alvin Neely's early life before his notorious crime spree, other than he was born in Georgia, where he would later die while behind bars. Soon after meeting Judith, Alvin left his wife and 3 children. He eloped with her in the summer of 1980 and she became Judith and Neely, a teen bride to a much older man. While she still hadn't fully recovered from the death of her father, an alcoholic who perished in a fatal motorcycle accident, it was ultimately meeting and marrying Alvin Neely that would be Judith and Neely's undoing. The two began a life of crime together, committing armed robberies as they traveled across the South. They slept in their car and the occasional motel room, mostly living on the run and stealing to support themselves, forging checks along the way. At 16, Judith and Neely became pregnant with twins. This didn't slow down the crime-committing couple though, who continued their robberies well into Judith's pregnancy. A botched robbery at a Georgia mall briefly put the pair behind bars. While incarcerated, Judith gave birth to twins. Upon their release, Alvin Neely and Judith and Neely reunited, and their criminal actions took a turn for the depraved. On September 25, 1982, Judith spotted 13-year-old Lisa Milliken at Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia. She convinced the young girl to join her and Alvin at a motel in nearby Scottsboro, Alabama. Upon arrival, Judith and Alvin seized upon Lisa. Over the course of the following days, they raped and tortured their victim, before eventually murdering her. On October 4, 1982, Judith targeted a young engaged couple named Janice Chapman and John Hancock. She claimed to be taking them to a party. In reality, Judith led the couple into the woods where Alvin was waiting. After shooting John Hancock and leaving him for dead, Judith and Alvin kidnapped Janice and brought her back to their Alabama motel room. They again tortured and then murdered their captive. Despite being shot, however, John Hancock had survived his attack. He was able to report the crime to authorities. On October 9, 1982, Judith Neely was arrested. Alvin was apprehended a few days later. Though both were sent to prison, Judith Neely was presented as the mastermind behind the killings. Alvin avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to murder and aggravated assault. Judith was not so lucky. She was convicted of the murder of Lisa Milliken and sentenced to death in 1983. The conviction made Judith the youngest woman to be sentenced to death in the United States. After a lengthy appeals process, Judith Neely's sentence was commuted to life in prison. She continues to spend her life in jail. Alvin lived out the rest of his days behind bars, dying in November of 2005. True crime author Thomas Cook cracks open this twisted case in early graves. Drawing on police records from District Attorney Richard Agu and investigator Danny Smith, he presents a gut-wrenching account of Alvin and Judith's relationship and their descent into darkness. They were on the road again, this time headed south, toward Macon. It had been a wild few days. Several months before, someone had called them Bonnie and Clyde, but they'd agreed that they were more like a comedy version of that infamous couple. Later, they'd even come up with a new name for themselves, Bonnie and Claude. But now, after all they'd done in Rome, they were coming close to the real thing. Shootings, firebombings. That was one way to show people you weren't joking anymore. But there were other ways, too, and on the way to Macon, they hatched a few new plans. In prison he'd been told that if you gave people certain kinds of shots, the cops wouldn't be able to tell they'd been murdered, so they stopped at a drugstore and picked up a few diabetic needles and a bottle of liquid Drano and liquid Plumber. Once on the road again, he kept his eyes on her brown Dodge as it cruised along in front of him. He liked his own car best, a red Ford Granada that he kept nice and neat. That was one of the differences between them. She was sloppy and unkempt, and her car always looked that way. That was one of the reasons he didn't want to drive with her anymore. The other was the way she acted, nice at times, then cold and mean. It was as if she would say things just to tick him off. Then the air would suddenly get sharp, and the whole world would start to ache. Traveling separately, and yet together, was one way to keep the pain at bay. It was better to have two cars and just talk to each other over the Cobra CB radios they had installed in each of them. Once in Macon, they stayed in another crummy little motel, the kind that smelled dank, as if there were pools of stagnant water under the floor. There were times when they hated it, but when that happened, they just moved on. That seemed to help a little, as if the movement, the endless heading down endless roads, was the only thing that relieved the tension that grew around them when they stopped. The road cut them some slack, but only for a while, only until they stopped again at the next motel, another one that looked the same, felt the same, had the same crummy furniture and dank wet smell. During their first couple of days in Macon, they came up with lots of great ideas, but finally agreed on just one to start with. He sat on the bed next to her when she dialed the phone. When Mrs. Allen answered, she told her that her husband was beating her up and that she needed help. Then she asked Mrs. Allen if she would meet her at her motel. Mrs. Allen said she would drop by the next day at around 5:30. The couple laughed together about how easy it was going to be. But Mrs. Allen was just the beginning, so the next day they rode around Macon looking for John Brownlee's house, one of the security people from the Macon YDC. There was a plan to deal with him, too, but that would come later, after they'd finished with Mrs. Allen. Then, suddenly, there was a hitch. At around 5 in the afternoon, someone from the YDC called to say that Mrs. Allen had had to go out of town and would not be able to come to the motel. They suspected Mrs. Allen had lied, and so the next day they drove out to the YDC office and spotted Allen's car. She'd not been called out of town at all. They shook their heads at what liars other people were. Since Mrs. Allen had slipped by, they decided to go after Brownlee instead. They drove and drove, chattering incessantly on the CB until they found Brownlee's house. Then they drove back to the motel and she called Brownlee up. She'd always known he had an eye for her, and so she spoke to him flirtatiously, using her hot little country girl act. She wanted to meet him, she said, then she reminded him he'd once told her that if she were ever in town, he wanted to see her. But Brownlee couldn't meet her because he'd gotten married only a few months before. Maybe some other time, he told her, if he could bring along his wife. After she hung up, they discussed a plan to drop her off at Brownlee's house when no one was at home. She could go through the window and let her husband in. Together they could wait for the Brownlees to get home, then he could knock Brownlee out, wait until he came to, and rape his wife in front of him. He could do that to all the wives of the men at the YDC. Every one of them who had done bad things to his wife. Now he could do bad things to their wives. Rape and kill them. That would show them it was really payback time. Perhaps they had slept through it all, he thought, but one child had been awake throughout, and he found himself focusing on her, a 13-year-old girl handcuffed in the car, silently watching as Neely paced the area, large and looming in the distance, perhaps stopping here and there to lean cautiously over the canyon wall, glance down, then back up at Lisa, making dreadful calculations. Igu knew what she was looking for, a place out of the way, with a sharp edge, a precipitous drop. But he wondered if Lisa had known that, too, as she sat in the car, listening to the little hissing breezes that seemed never entirely to abandon the canyon edge. Perhaps, instead, Lisa had tried to tell herself that Neely was looking for something else, a place where she could safely let her go, or let the children play, or, much more simply, perhaps only a mountain flower to bring back to them, something soft and pretty to greet them when they woke. But if Lisa had harbored such comforting hopes, they were quickly to be dashed. "I told her to get out," Neely said. "And I took her over to the tree and I told her to lay down right there and I told her I was going to give her a shot to put her to sleep so I could leave and she wouldn't know where I was going." Lisa did as she was told, Neely continued, and while she lay on the ground, handcuffed to a tree, Neely bent over her and gave her a shot in the left side of her neck, pressing down on the small black plunger, releasing a caustic drain cleaner, liquid Drano, into Lisa Milliken's throat. Igu closed his eyes slowly as he listened. He could almost hear her tiny moan. "The liquid Drano hadn't worked," Neely went on, "so I got the liquid plumber." There followed another shot on the other side of the neck, but it didn't work either. Lisa continued to lie face down on the ground, Neely said. She was moaning softly and complaining that the shots were hurting her. Neely administered another shot, this one in Lisa's left arm, then, after a short interval, another into her right arm. Neither of them worked, and so the next one went into Lisa's right buttock, and still another into her left buttock. And still, it didn't work. She said it was hurting, Neely said matter-of-factly. But Lisa was still alive, she added, the shots were not killing her. Igu glanced toward the window. It was mid-October, but the cold outside the room seemed like nothing compared to the cold within it. "Why did you think about liquid plumber and Drano?" Smith asked. He answered, "'Cause it had lye in it." "So at this point, you'd given her 6 different shots," Wetzel said. "Was she handcuffed at this point? Do you know how long you waited to see if it was going to do anything?" "The first one she was handcuffed 'cause I didn't know what it was going to do," Neely explained. "I kept them on 'cause she might get violent." "About a half an hour," Judy answered. Egu felt his breath stop. Half an hour. Terror lengthened seconds into days. He could not imagine the eternity of half an hour. "Did the shots have any effect?" Smith asked. "She said they burned," Neely answered dully. "She said she was cold. She wanted me to give her a shirt and let her lay down." He asked, "Did you?" He answered, "Yes." Lisa was burning, and she was cold, but she wouldn't die. Because of that, it was time to take the next step. After Alvin, Neely and Judith and Neely were apprehended for the murders of Lisa Milliken and Janice Chapman, they were each sentenced to life in prison, Alvin in Georgia and Judith in Alabama, never to see each other again. Initially, they were both supposed to receive the death penalty until Alvin pleaded guilty, saving himself from that fate. Judith's death penalty was to be carried out since it was deduced that she was the mastermind behind the couple's gruesome crimes. However, 3 days before her death date, the governor of Alabama instead gave her a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. The governor's decision caused controversy and outrage. Many believed that Judith and Neely deserved the death penalty or at least life imprisonment without parole for her heinous actions. Despite this, Judith has never been approved for parole, being denied as recently as 2018. She continues to serve her sentence in Alabama, with another possibility of parole in 2023. In 2015, Maria Sosa allegedly spoke with a man she thought was a hitman and offered him money and gifts if he would kill her husband, Houston area boxing coach Ramon Sosa. Maria Sosa was born Maria Lourdes Durantes in Mexico on February 11, 1974. She was a dancer known as Lulu at a salsa club known as Mi Luna, which is where she met retired boxer Ramon Sosa in 2007. The couple got married 2 years later, the second marriage for Ramon, as he was divorced with 3 adult children. Maria became a U.S. citizen later on in the marriage, with Ramon helping not only Maria, but her mother and her own teenage children become legalized citizens. A year later, the couple opened Woodland Boxing and Fitness, a gym in Houston. Once Maria received her citizenship, she underwent a noticeable change in personality. Mia Sosa, Ramon's daughter, stated in an interview that Maria wanted nothing to do with her stepchildren and resorted to starting fights and causing disarray amongst the family. Ramon himself revealed that while they were on vacation in Puerto Rico, Maria started an argument that led to her calling hotel security with accusations that Ramon was abusing her, only for her statements to be proven false. By March of 2015, Maria took money from their gym and used it to get a divorce lawyer, while continuing to make random accusations of embezzlement, abuse, and even rape against Ramon, all of which were rebuffed. Maria turned heel months later by planning to have Ramon killed, even going as far voicing her murderous desire to a friend/protege of Ramon's and Gustavo, who was often called Mundo. When asked by Maria if he knew someone who could kill Ramon, he recommended someone to her, but afterwards, Mundo went straight to Ramon and informed his mentor about Maria's heel turn and her plot against him. The pair worked together to have the villainess arrested, which included going to the police, who sent an officer to go undercover and pose as a hitman and meet Maria. The meeting saw Maria vent and lash out against Ramon, and repeatedly voice her desire to want her ex-husband dead. As part of the scheme, Ramon's death was staged, as he was placed in a shallow grave and portrayed himself as having been fatally shot near the temple, with Maria being shown the photo of the deceased Ramon. The villainess actually smiled and laughed over the image before paying the hitman, but on the following day, Maria ended up arrested as she returned to the gym. In October of 2016, Maria pleaded guilty to the murder-for-hire scheme and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She had been denied parole at every turn, and with the year she had already served following her arrest, she is set to be released sometime in July of 2035, which would see Maria reach the age of 61. Throughout the entire trial, Maria refused to look at Ramon and showed no remorse for her actions, which doesn't surprise this true crime enthusiast. Plain and simple, Maria was greedy, callous, and cold-hearted. This, in my view, is a classic case of a person who had nothing, then after seeing that they've hit the jackpot, they want it all and will even resort to murder to get it. Maria definitely believed that she won the lottery when she married Ramon. She went from being a dancer to being a prominent businesswoman, but it wasn't enough for Maria. After getting what she had longed for, she showed her true colors and started biting the hand that fed her, an understatement, in a quest to get everything, and when she didn't get what she wanted, she saw Ramon as an obstacle and planned to eliminate him. In all, Maria Sosa was truly a cold-blooded villainess, and this true crime tale continues to fascinate me every time I think about it. In October 16, Maria Sosa was sentenced to up to 20 years in prison. At the time of writing, Sosa is serving her time at the Christina Melton Crane Unit. According to the Texas Department of Corrections, she has a projected release date of October 18, 2023, but she is eligible for parole before that date. After a whirlwind romance, Christy Chen thought she'd found the man of her dreams. Now that man, Bradley Dawson, is sitting in a Fiji jail cell, accused of brutally murdering her. When Christy Chen married Bradley Dawson 3 months after they met, friends of the recent pharmacy school graduate were concerned, but also hopeful she'd finally found the love of her life. It was a shock, says Chen's friend Morris Apre of her decision to marry the recently divorced Dawson, 38, a Memphis-based IT specialist. It happened so quickly. Now her friends are struggling to make sense of the nightmare that unfolded just 2 days into the couple's honeymoon in July at one of the planet's most beautiful locations, Fiji's ultra-private Turtle Island, where villas start at $3,500 a night. Bradley Dawson, 38, is charged with murdering his new wife, Christy Chen, 36, on the night of July 8. He was arrested after allegedly fleeing that night to the nearby island of Matakawalavu, and is being held without bail until trial. Bradley Dawson claimed through his lawyer that Chen's death was an accident. Her family's lawyer, Ronald Gordon, said that Chen died of multiple blunt force trauma wounds to her head and face. It doesn't look like it was an accidental pushing, and she fell and hit her head, and something happened, Gordon stated. A woman who was also staying at the Turtle Island Resort, which can accommodate up to 14 couples at any given time, told Fiji authorities she saw the couple on the night of the alleged fight but said they appeared to be in good spirits. Other witnesses allegedly heard the newlyweds arguing at a dinner the night Chen was killed. Dawson admitted to ABC News that he and Chen did have a drunken argument that evening. Sometime that evening, the woman who said they seemed fine at dinner reportedly heard loud banging sounds from the couple's suite, according to police reports. It was as if someone was drunk and unable to control themselves inside, the woman told police. And then we heard a loud scream followed by a big, loud bang, and after that, there was complete silence. Resort staff confirmed to the news outlet that someone had lodged a noise complaint that night. According to Dawson, he chose to board a kayak after the fight and leave the resort for a neighboring island in an alleged attempt to de-escalate the situation. I just wanted to give her some space, Dawson told reporters, implying Chen was still alive when he left. It was normal for me to take a walk. Dawson would have had to have kayaked more than 3 miles in the Pacific Ocean to reach Matakawalavu from the resort. Chen's family lawyer, Ronald Gordon, told Fox News Dawson left his GPS-enabled watch but took his passport and wallet with him when he left to kayak and ultimately ended up on Matakawalavu. A housekeeper found Chen's body the following day when the newlyweds failed to show up for breakfast. Dawson was arrested 2 days later on the west coast of Fiji's mainland, Viti Levu, in the town of Nadi. His location was reportedly given away by indigenous residents on a nearby remote island after Dawson allegedly tried to flee. Fiji authorities said Dawson initially confessed to the murder before lawyering up. Dawson was an IT specialist for a non-profit organization that works with children until his recent suspension in light of the allegations. He appeared for a preliminary bail hearing at the Lautoka High Court on Wednesday, where Judge Riaz Hamza rejected requests for Dawson's pretrial release. Dawson's defense lawyer, Iqbal Khan, argued the case could take 2 years, asking why should he remain inside for that long. Judge Hamza also denied a request by Gordon to have the Chen family as a formal party in the case, which could allow relatives less restricted access to the evidence presented in the trial. They can still attend hearings. Chen graduated from the University of Tennessee and worked as a pharmacist in a Memphis area Kroger. She was a noted community pharmacy resident at the university's Health Science Center, having received awards in pharmaceutical science. Neighbors stated they hadn't heard the couple argue in the past. The relationship had been a whirlwind romance, with some of Chen's friends claiming they hadn't met Dawson until the couple married in February. The couple embarked on their honeymoon 5 months later. The Turtle Island Resort is a 5-star luxury destination with sweeping views, offering rooms at several $1,000s per night, according to their website. The resort had also served as a vacation destination for Dawson and a previous wife just 2 years ago. It's unclear why the couple divorced, but Good Morning America reported the divorce wasn't finalized until the month before Dawson married Chen. His college ex-girlfriend told the program that, when they dated in 2005, the romance was definitely intense and fast, but that, after they became serious, Dawson was very verbally manipulative and threatening and jealous, and that he'd pushed her down and chased her. Gordon said Chen's family might seek a wrongful death lawsuit against Dawson in the future. If convicted, he faces life in prison. Disgraced former NYPD cop Michael Valva, found guilty of murder in the freezing death of his autistic son, was hit with a sentence in 2022 of 25 years to life in the sickening case. Judge William Condon, noting the emotional toll the trial had taken, handed down the sentence in Suffolk County, delivering the maximum punishment for Valva's November conviction of second-degree murder. Valva, 43, was found guilty in the heartbreaking 2020 death of his 8-year-old son, Thomas, after the ex-cop locked the little boy in an unheated garage overnight. Condon said, "This was the most stressful trial I've ever been a part of as either a lawyer or a judge. Everybody who took part in this trial lost sleep, didn't eat, had nightmares. It was difficult for everyone." His voice breaking, a tearful Valva said he accepted the sentence as I have already sentenced myself to a life of extreme remorse, loss and grief. First want to express to you and everyone involved in case I am truly sorry. I am regretful and ashamed, heartbroken and grief-stricken, he said. I loved Thomas with all my heart. I terribly failed my boys, instead of providing them with unconditional love and support, he said. My actions were neglectful and abusive to my boys, resulting in the tragic death of Thomas. Judge Condon, I did not want my son to die. I never imagined he would have died. However, I lost my way, thinking punishments were temporary and eventually would get us back to normal, he said. I was so wrong, and it cost Thomas his life. Thomas died of hypothermia after being exposed to freezing temperatures for up to 16 hours, with the mercury dipping below 20 degrees. The boy's older brother Anthony, then 10, survived the same heinous treatment. The pair's exile to the garage was the culmination of a pattern of abuse. The principal at Thomas's school testified at trial that educators had made a slew of calls to Child Protective Services over concerns the brothers were being abused at home. I appreciate and I think you are sincere in saying you're sorry. I really do, Condon said, addressing the ex-cop. I don't think you intended to kill Thomas. But there's no getting around the fact that Thomas and Anthony lived their young lives under constant duress in the place where they should have felt safest, in their own home, he added. Valva's former position at the NYPD made his actions all the more unconscionable. Rather than be his children's protector, he was a warden who starved and repeatedly punished, the judge added. One question still beguiles me, Condon said. How did all of us as a community allow this to happen? And I acknowledge this is not the appropriate forum to have this discussion, but it needs to happen. An 8-year-old boy who right now should have been getting excited for Christmas is dead, he said. Juror Christina Anselmo told the Post she was surprised by Valva's emotional display. We hadn't heard him cry or speak at all the entire time, so to see him actually kind of show some sort of remorse or feeling, that's not something we ever saw during the trial nor on any of the videos or audio recordings we heard as audience, she said. I believe there's some remorse there. I don't think he intended on that happening, she added, but he sure enough didn't do anything to stop it, so that's what makes him guilty. Another juror, Scott Crusson, wasn't convinced about Valva's remorse. I think a lot of those tears was the fact that he knows he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life. He showed no emotion at all at the trial, he said. Defense attorney John Loturco said that he loved his kids. His definition of love must be different than mine, Crusson added. I couldn't imagine any father doing what he did to his kids. Valva's emotional effect was brought up at trial as well. An emergency worker who fought to save little Thomas testified at trial. Valva had no emotion, no sense of concern for his son, and told first responders he found the boy unconscious after hitting his head on a doorframe. "We all came to see closure. We wanted to make sure that this man got the absolute biggest sentence that he could under the law," juror Thomas Malloy told the Post. "He convicted him. We didn't convict him," Malloy added. In April 2009, the teen from New York came down to Myrtle Beach for spring break. She was last seen outside the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, and then she vanished. It wasn't until 13 years later, when a stunning confession in May 2022 brought closure to a case that haunted the Grand Strand for 13 years, the disappearance of Brittany Drexel, a man named Raymond Moody, who was once a person of interest in the case, came forward and confessed that he had raped, kidnapped and killed Drexel the very night that she disappeared. Raymond Moody, 62, a longtime person of interest in the case, said in court after entering his guilty plea. He said, "I was a monster then, and I was a monster when I took Brittany Drexel's life. I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel. I'm very sorry." The judge sentenced Moody to consecutive terms of 30 years on the charges of kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct and a life sentence on the first-degree murder charge for kidnapping, raping and strangling the 17-year-old high school soccer star who dreamed of becoming a nurse or cosmetologist. In his victim statement to the court before Moody was sentenced, Drexel's stepfather, Chad Drexel, who with her mother, Dawn Plecken, searched tirelessly for the teen, said he'd always held out hope that she would be one day found. 13 years later, I find out the horrible and disgusting way she was murdered, he said, choking back tears. Plecken had harsher words for Moody. I hope you suffer in prison for the rest of your useless life, said Plecken, who never stopped looking for her daughter. For more than a decade, Drexel's parents wondered what happened to the outgoing junior at Gates Chile High School in Chile, New York. Unbeknownst to her parents, on April 22, 2009, Drexel joined a group of friends who were going to Myrtle Beach for spring break. I didn't know she was going, Plecken previously told People. The day she left she was angry with me because she asked me if she could go and I told her no. I said, there's no adults going, and I have no idea who these kids are and I don't feel comfortable with it. Plecken added, I told her I just felt something was going to happen to her. On April 25, 2009, Drexel left her hotel alone and headed to the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, the busy main drag in Myrtle Beach, to visit a friend who was staying there. She was last seen at about 8:45 p.m. when surveillance cameras captured her leaving the hotel in a black and white tank top, shorts and flip-flops, say authorities. She texted her boyfriend back home that she was walking back to the Bar Harbor, a motor and a mile and a half down the road, where she and her friends were staying. She was never heard from again. Her cell phone transmitted its last known signal the day after she disappeared near the South Santee River, between McClellanville and Georgetown, say authorities. For years, local authorities and the FBI searched for her, holding press conferences along the way asking for the public's help. In May of this year, her body was finally found buried in the South Carolina woods. Details about what happened to Drexel when she vanished were finally revealed when police arrested Moody that month, after he directed them to the spot where he'd buried her body. The day after Drexel vanished, police in the nearby town of Surfside stopped Moody for speeding, according to the arrest warrant, but authorities would not identify him as a potential person of interest in the case for another 2 years. Moody was living an hour from Myrtle Beach at a motel in Georgetown, South Carolina, in 2009 when Drexel was last seen, investigators said. According to authorities, Moody kidnapped Drexel as she walked alone along the Myrtle Beach Strip. Thanks to advances in cell phone technology, starting in 2019, authorities were able to track Drexel's phone, showing that she went from walking on the strip to traveling in a car and ending up in the Georgetown County area, Assistant Solicitor Scott Hickson explained in court. The case came to a head in April 2022 when Moody's girlfriend, Angel Voss, agreed to help the FBI and wear a wire and talk to Moody about what happened to Drexel. On May 5, 2022, Moody admitted what he did to Drexel, Hickson said. He told authorities he and Voss were driving in Myrtle Beach when they saw Drexel and asked her to party with them, Hickson said. He said she got into the car voluntarily, which her family disputed. He said he drove Voss and Drexel to a campsite in Georgetown County, where they smoked marijuana. When Voss left, Moody said he wanted to have sex with Drexel. When she refused, he raped her. Worried that he might get in trouble for raping Drexel, he strangled her, wrapped her body in a blanket and hid her in the woods, Hickson said. When Voss returned, he told her Drexel's friends had picked her up. He returned to the campsite later on, moved Drexel's body and buried it in another location. Moody is a registered sex offender who spent 21 years in prison following a 1983 abduction and rape case in California involving a 9-year-old girl. The guilty plea and sentencing are bittersweet for Drexel's family. "I'll never be able to walk Brittany down the aisle, and neither will her blood father or Dawn," Chad Drexel said. "She'll never be able to see my granddaughter, her niece who is amazing, all that's snatched away from us." Growing up, Richard Hanchett heard stories about his biological mother, how beautiful she was, with red hair and blue eyes, and how much she loved singing. "Just a really nice person," Mr. Hanchett, 64, said. But he never met Ruth Marie Terry. She chose to have him adopted right after he was born in 1958, entrusting him to a couple who worked with her at a plant that made door panels and seat covers for cars in Livonia, Michigan. She was 21 at the time. In 2018, hoping to find her, Mr. Hanchett, who lives in Waterford, Michigan, took a DNA test through Ancestry.com and met her family in Tennessee. That's when he learned that she had been missing since the early 1970s and that her relatives there had been searching for her for decades. On Monday, October 31, 2022, the family finally learned what had happened to her when the FBI announced that a badly mutilated body found nearly 50 years ago in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, was that of Miss Terry, who was 37 and originally from Tennessee. On Wednesday, November 2, 2022, the authorities announced a new development in the investigation, saying that they were seeking information about a man, now deceased, named Guy Rockwell Moldovan, whom Miss Terry was believed to have married shortly before she was murdered. Mr. Moldovan, born in 1923, was a former antiques dealer who was arrested in 1960 in connection with the disappearance of his former wife and her daughter after mutilated remains, believed to be theirs, were found in their Seattle home. Mr. Moldovan was given a suspended sentence in the case and was freed in 1962. Court records indicate that Mr. Moldovan married Miss Terry in Reno, Nevada, in February 1974, just months before she was killed. Miss Terry's nephew Jim Terry said that the last time he had seen Miss Terry was in July or August of 1973, in a motel room in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with Mr. Moldovan. His mother thought she was going to California, and his father thought she was headed up north, Mr. Terry said. "We never heard from her again," said Mr. Terry, 60, adding, "I was a kid. I just remember a big smile and her auburn hair." Miss Terry's family later learned about Mr. Moldovan's connection to the disappearance of his wife and her daughter in Seattle. "It sure gave me the chills when I read that," Mr. Hanchett said. Last week, at the request of investigators, he submitted a DNA sample to confirm that the body found in Provincetown was that of his biological mother. "I couldn't believe when I found out who she was," he said on Tuesday, one day after officials had briefed him on the breakthrough at an FBI office in Troy, Michigan. "And now I'm finding out where she was and what happened." Miss Terry's nude body was found on a beach blanket on Race Point Beach on July 26, 1974, by a girl who was hiking with her family. Miss Terry's hands were missing, presumably removed by her killer so she could not be identified with fingerprints, and her nearly severed head rested on folded jeans, the FBI said. Investigators said she had been killed by a blow to the head, probably several weeks earlier. Detectives canvassed motels and rooming houses, reviewed thousands of reports of missing women, checked every vehicle licensed to drive on the dunes and used clay models to recreate what she might have looked like. But they were unable to identify the woman they called the Lady of the Dunes, and her case haunted a generation of investigators and Cape Cod residents. She was said by the FBI to have been the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts. As the trail went cold, some speculated that she had been killed by the notorious South Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger. The writer Joe Hill, a son of Stephen King, believed she might have been an extra from the movie Jaws, which was filmed on nearby Martha's Vineyard that year. In 2000, the authorities exhumed her remains from a cemetery in Provincetown to extract a DNA sample. But it wasn't until recently that they were able to identify her through genetic genealogy, the same technique that was used to identify the Golden State Killer, among many others. At a news conference on Monday, law enforcement officials said they were now turning their attention to finding Ms. Terry's killer by tracing her history and asking the public for tips. They did not mention Mr. Moldovan. He died in 2002 at age 78 in Salinas, California, according to an obituary in the Monterey County Herald. It's very likely that the person who did this is dead, Michael D. O'Keefe, the district attorney for Cape Cod, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, told reporters. But they may not be, and so the message to them, if they're still out there, is, we're coming. Ms. Terry grew up in Whitwell, Tennessee, about 24 miles northwest of Chattanooga, and left home when she was a teenager, Mr. Terry said. By the time she reached Livonia, Michigan, she had been married once and separated, and was known as Ruth Smith, Mr. Hanchett said. She lived in California in the 1960s, Mr. Terry said, and then returned to Tennessee. Mr. O'Keefe said there was no information to suggest that Ms. Terry had ever been reported to the authorities as a missing person. But Mr. Terry said that his sister, Marilyn Renee Hill, who died last year, had used genealogical websites and DNA tests to conduct her own investigation. My sister was kind of hellbent on trying to find her, he said, even in the later years. Mr. Hanchett, a retired software engineer for General Motors, said that he had helped Ms. Hill, searching online for names and addresses she would give him. Mr. Hanchett said that Ms. Terry had tried to contact him once when he was about 13, but he rejected her overture, which he deeply regrets. He said he hoped to have her reburied next to her parents in Tennessee. Everybody that I talked to who knew her adored her, he said. I wish I could have just talked to her, touched her once. Ted Kaczynski said, you can't eat your cake and have it too. To gain one thing you have to sacrifice another. This reversal of the famous saying was one of the phrases within the Eco-Anarchist Manifesto anonymously submitted to newspapers across America by Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. FBI shorthand for University and Airline Bomber, Kaczynski became known nationwide for a series of bombings between 1978 and 1995 that targeted scientific universities, airlines, and businesses for their role in the over-industrialization of society and destruction of nature. With an IQ of 167, Kaczynski was a certified genius. He was born in Illinois in 1942, graduated high school and entered Harvard at age 15, completed his PhD in mathematics at 25, and became the youngest professor to be hired by the University of California, Berkeley, that same year. He was lauded by academics for his first-rate mind and published several successful mathematical treatises, but teaching proved to be too much of a task for his awkward and reserved social nature. Kaczynski left his position to return home in 1969 and moved to his now famous cabin in the isolated wilderness of Lincoln, Montana just 2 years later. Kaczynski wanted to learn to be self-sufficient and live off the land in the barest, most natural conditions possible. His plan was going relatively well until, over the years, he began to notice the land around him increasingly destroyed by development and industrial growth. After seeing several of his favorite spots bulldozed or paved over, he started his first foray into eco-terrorism with small acts of defiance against the local developers. Given his extremely high intelligence, however, he quickly delved into the more serious philosophical and political parts of the movement. He soon came to the conclusion that the only way to stop the progression of technology and industrialization into our lives was by violent rebellion against the system. Simple activism would not be enough to make people understand the gravity of the threat, he argued. They must be forced out of their comfortable lives and into action. Kaczynski delivered his first bomb in 1978. He taught himself how to make the explosives out of pieces of scrap material and wood that was untraceable. Construction was all done by hand, without the assistance of power tools, and even making the simple tools he did need by hand. He cast certain metal parts, including aluminum, by melting metal scraps on the wood-burning stove of his cabin, and any store-bought purchases were made far away from his cabin, often while in disguise. The first bomb was sent to a professor at Northwestern University on May 25, who reported the suspicious package to authorities. The officer opened the package and detonated the device, but thanks to its inefficient materials only suffered minor wounds. Kaczynski continued to use the mail service or deliver his bombs directly. His case reached the FBI's desk in 1979 when he placed a bomb in the cargo hold of a commercial airplane. Although the attack ultimately failed, it still fell under the Bureau's jurisdiction. Kaczynski continued his crusade and caused his first fatality in 1985, when a Sacramento computer store owner named John Hauser received a bomb containing makeshift shrapnel and died from his injuries. Kaczynski then took an unexpected break from his attacks, sending only one device between 1986 and 1993. After resuming again in 1993, he orchestrated 2 more bombings before claiming his second victim the following year. That recipient was Thomas Valva, an executive at the Burson-Marsteller public relations firm that represented Exxon Valdez after their disastrous oil spill in 1989. In 1995, his final bomb claimed the life of his third victim, Gilbert Brent Murray, who worked for the California Forestry Association to lobby on behalf of the logging industry. During his destructive career, Kaczynski sent 16 bombs, killing 3 and wounding 23 more. In 1995, Kaczynski sent his manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, to the New York Times and Washington Post, along with a letter demanding that it be published for the masses or else he would continue his crusade. In it, he railed against the consequences of the Industrial Revolution that have divorced humans from their natural environment and laid out his solution, calling for the inevitable revolution of the people against the technology taking over their lives and a return to primitive life. At this point, the FBI had to decide whether or not to appease their opponent. They did not want to risk boosting his ego by giving him a national stage for his cause, but were also in desperate need of new leads in the case. Thanks to Kaczynski's ability to meticulously cover his tracks, including planting false evidence in the bombs to further mislead the authorities, the investigation had been going for 17 years and had become one of the most expensive cases in FBI history. So the manifesto was published on September 19 and with an appeal for tips. Fortunately, this plan paid off when the manifesto was seen by Kaczynski's brother and sister-in-law, David and Linda. David compared the treatise to previous letters and works by his brother and felt that the authors were one and the same. Knowing that the FBI was inundated with thousands of other tips, David hired a private investigator to gather evidence and compile a dossier that was turned over to the authorities in February of 1996. Although some investigators were not convinced that Kaczynski matched the profile of the suspect, completion of the linguistic analysis on the writing samples led a small group of other team members to believe that he was their man. The debate continued for 2 months until the suspect's identity was leaked to the press, after which the team rushed to execute a search warrant before the story broke and alerted Kaczynski. When agents arrived at Kaczynski's cabin on April 3, 1996, they found stacks of bomb-making materials, thousands of journal pages relating to the crimes, and a bomb that was fully assembled. Kaczynski was indicted on 10 counts of bomb-related activity and 3 counts of murder. Although his lawyers urged him to plead insanity to avoid facing the death penalty, he refused to do so. He instead chose to plead guilty to all charges on January 22, 1998. He was sentenced to 8 life terms without parole and was sentenced to the super maximum security prison facility in Florence, Colorado. A former Chase employee and her husband stole $50,000 from a dementia-ridden man, then killed his daughter and grandson after they started asking questions, police say. Cynthia Stack, 52, and 22-year-old Sean Stack were found shot to death in their Center Hill of Florida apartment on July 18. Joshua Ramsamy, 28, was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with a firearm, while his wife, Amelia Bassoon, 25, was charged with 2 counts of principal to first-degree murder. It all started when a 25-year-old banker at Chase Bank met a 75-year-old customer named Jerry Stack. Officers say Amelia Bassoon and her husband Joshua Ramsamy murdered Jerry's daughter, Cynthia Stack, and her son Sean on July 18, 2018. Ramsamy and Bassoon were said to have killed the mother and son in efforts to cover up that they were stealing money from Cynthia's father, who suffered a traumatic brain injury and is said to possibly have dementia. Cynthia's father even went as far to follow Bassoon when she moved to a different location. Bassoon is said to have made two $25,000 checks out to her young son, taking the money from the man's account. Ramsamy was said to have then opened two Bank of America accounts and deposited the money in them. According to police, Cynthia began inquiring about the money, which would eventually lead to Ramsamy buying a gun and shooting them both. The couple wouldn't come forth with the truth initially, but Bassoon eventually admitted to her husband killing the two. Neither of the suspects had had previous records. A neighbor found Cynthia dead on a futon on July 19 when she was walking her dog and noticed their door was still open. Sean was discovered by Orlando police in a different part of the apartment when they arrived on the scene at approximately 7 a.m. The family's puppy, less than a year old, was found also at the scene and taken by the Orlando Police Department. "It's a sad and sick situation for people to take advantage of someone like that," said Emily Rivera, Cynthia's daughter and Sean's younger sister. "They did nothing to deserve this. They were an innocent family minding their own business, trying to live their life like everyone else. Sean was just always so grateful for what he had, even though he didn't have that much," she added. "My mother was always trying to spread her love to other people, always trying to help other people. She was just the sweetest woman."
A Zenith Ducat was killed on her way home from school back in 1980. 10 TV's Brittany Bailey reports on the long wait for answers. It's a case she's been researching for nearly 2 years.
The death of a Zenith Ducat here in this Upper Arlington community made an impact that lasted for decades, and now police say her case is finally solved.
We have closed the Ducat murder case.
That was the announcement from Upper Arlington Police on Thursday. More than 40 years after a Zenith Ducat was murdered on her way home from school, police are officially naming her accused killer.
After 42 years, Upper Arlington police say they have identified a suspect in the death of 8-year-old Zenith Ducat, whose homicide has been one of the area's most infamous unsolved cases. On Thursday, Upper Arlington Police posted an update on their website, saying that DNA technology advancements have helped them identify Brent Strutner as the suspect in the case. Strutner died by suicide in June 1984 at the age of 24. On June 3, 1980, Ducat left Barrington Elementary School and started the approximately 1-mile walk to her home on Malvern Road, but she never got there. About 4 hours after she was reported missing, Upper Arlington police said Ducat's body was found in a shallow stream at the mouth of a culvert near First Community Village. A 20-pound limestone rock had been used to hit her in the head, police said. Her death, which remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, rocked the Upper Arlington community. Over the years, police identified more than a dozen people as possible suspects for investigation, and hypnotized a number of people in attempts to solve the case. In the end, it was DNA that led police to the person they believe was the killer. Police said Strutner was a 1979 graduate of Upper Arlington High School and had been living near Upper Arlington when Ducat was killed. In 2008, police received information about a DNA profile being recovered from evidence collected in the case that matched Strutner. Detectives then re-examined every other piece of evidence to determine if Strutner acted alone or with anyone else, but found no DNA to implicate anyone else. Around the time of Ducat's death, a number of young females were attacked, including an attempt to abduct a young girl on Henderson Road. That attack, Upper Arlington police said, was only months after Ducat's homicide and was made by a man who associated with Strutner. That man, who served time in prison for the attempted abduction, also was investigated as being involved in Ducat's death. Police said the division was unable to discover sufficient evidence to also link him to the murder of a Zenith. Detectives also re-interviewed a number of witnesses and people of interest to determine if any other evidence would come to light. The division is confident that all investigative leads have been exhausted. Sergeant Brian McKean said police interviewed nearly 1,000 witnesses over the more than 40 years of investigation. He said that while police had a DNA profile matching Strutner in 2008, they did not want to release information publicly until they were absolutely certain they had answers. He added, "We wanted to make sure all the pieces and parts were tied together before we released anything." Strutner was a suspect long before we had the ability to identify him. Police Chief Steve Farmer said the department has worked tirelessly for years to solve the case. Members of the Long Walk Home, the SNF Ducat project, said in a statement that Thursday's press release from Upper Arlington only confirmed what they've known and shared through their project since its inception in 2019. The case may be closed by the city of Upper Arlington, but it is far from closed for us, the group said in a statement. We applaud the countless hours and hard work that lead to the confirmation of Brent Strutner's involvement in the crime. However, after viewing the totality of the evidence, it is reasonable to conclude Brent Strutner did not act alone. Our mission will continue based on that belief, and as long as the Ducat family and our community continue to support our efforts to bring all involved to justice. Sergeant McKean said being able to give the Ducat family answers after more than 4 decades has been bittersweet. He added, "This case is all about sadness. For the officers who worked on it, they'll carry it with them forever. This is one of those cases that haunts you." McKean said the case also spoke to the strength of the community in Upper Arlington. Many residents participated in searches for Ducat when she was reported missing, and have cooperated with the investigation through the years while holding out hope that the case would be solved. Every person involved wanted to get to this point, he said. We hope it brings some little bit of peace to the Ducat family. Bittersweet is also how Leslie Lyon, a friend of Ducat's, described hearing the news. Lyon was 9 years old when her childhood friend was murdered. The two often played jump rope at recess and were in the same Sunday school class at Our Lady of Victory Church in Marble Cliff. Sometimes the girls walked home together, but Lyon was already on her way by the time Ducat's class was excused that day. She said, "It's still hard to talk about. For most of us who lived through it, there's been so much speculation over the years that it doesn't really bring closure. The hardest part," Lyon said, "is knowing that Strutner is also dead because it means there will be no justice." Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the video, and click the bell icon to stay tuned.